Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Barevna Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha v'finu b'fiyamcha Beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאימך בית ישראל, כולנו יודע שמך ולמדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Okay, so we're going to hit the Mishnah Brura by Rabbi Daniel Brody, and the subject matter is relying on someone else's hamotzi or benching. So basically, before we get into the details of a zimun, let's quickly review the rules of being covered by another person's brocha with regard to food. Okay, so if we're looking at hamotzi, it's seeming to distinguish between hamotzi and bikata matzon, meaning the hamotzi is the before brocha, where we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So when it comes to hamotzi, one can even ideally rely on the brocha of another. That is, they need not make their own hamotzi if one is saying hamotzi has in mind to cover the others at the table. So bearing in mind to be, both parties have to have each other in mind. In other words, when I'm saying the Torah reading brocha for you, I've got to have in mind you and myself, and you've got to have in mind that I'm saying it on your behalf. And the listeners have to have in mind to be covered by the brocha themselves, whether it's a male or a female. Of course, whoever says the hamotzi for others must eat the bread too. When it comes to brochas on food, the person making the brocha must eat in order to cover the others. And that's why, because of my sugar allergies, I generally don't do the brocha on one for others if I'm not going to be partaking. So with regards to Birkat Hamazon, ideally one should rather bench oneself and not rely on listening to another. So we're going to discuss a zuman, because this would seem to contradict it, because with a zuman, if there are 3 Jewish men, it's better to be in a zuman, but we have to know that obviously in that particular case there is a group intention. What we're talking about here is a function. Sometimes when you go to the shuls, where one person benches on behalf of the other group, and they don't always have the right kavona in mind. You know, they say a general rabotain of a rape, but they don't always have the presence of mind. So when it comes to Birkat Hamazon, why should you should ideally bench yourself and not rely on listening to others? So there are 2 reasons for it. Firstly, Birkat Hamazon is already the end of the meal, and so it is if people in the meal are not one unit, and thus each one needs to make their own benching. So as opposed to hamotzi, which is at the beginning of the meal and everybody's waiting as a singular unit in the table to be covered by a singular hamotzi, because nothing happens until hamotzi takes place. Sometimes when you're at a group function, certain people are still eating even though they shouldn't, so there's not a group cognizance of the same sort of timing as when you start with the hamotzi. The second reason is Birkat Hamazon is a Torah brocha mitzvah, doraisa, and thus one should avoid relying on listening to another's brocha in order to be covered. But hamotzi is actually a rabbinic brocha, darabanon, and therefore one can rely on listening to another person's brocha. However, if a person needs to, they can rely on listening to another person who has in mind to cover them, specifically has in mind to cover them. Not obviously if you're going to a group function en masse, just that it is better to do it themselves. According to some poskim, one cannot be covered by listening to a brocha if one doesn't understand it. Although we rule that one is indeed covered even without understanding it in such cases, it would be better if the person listening to each word, together with the one who's benching aloud, is covered by them. So this is in the Shulchan Aruch 193 and the Mishnah Brura 193. Just one note, guys, that I wanted to tell you. As far as a mezuman that covers 10 men, that generally is a point where it's a small enough group where everybody is at the same point of finishing the meal, like for example for Shiva brochas, etc. Whereas it's different in a community-based function. The second thing is we're not saying here that you don't do a zimun. Again, a zimun is the beginning part of the brocha, but you benching at the same pace as the leader of the benching, but you are benching yourself. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, when he's saying Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hazanu olam, you are benching in unison with the timing. So you are benching yourself. You're just using the power of the zimun. But you can't just listen and say Amen. Sometimes women tend to not do their own benching properly, and they'll just respond Amen. All right, guys, I hope you learned some halacha while we've been at it. It's lovely to see you all. Now, what we're going to do is before we hit the Mishnah on the last part of the 23rd daf, I just want to make this clear, this case clear with regards to Rav Yosef quickly. So on 23b3, sorry, I heard hooting. Can you all hear me, guys? You can unmute yourselves.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So the Gemara records an incident in the ruling concerning it. There were these goats owned by the Tabu family that would cause damage to the property of Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said to Abiah, go tell their owners that they should keep them inside their property. And Abiah said to Rav Yosef, for what purpose shall I go? What will I accomplish? For if I go and tell them what you said, my master, they will tell me that the master should rather build a fence around his own land. And so we need to just examine why this is brought in. So basically, Abiah didn't really want to get involved in a dispute between Rav Yosef and his neighbors, because he said that the neighbors will claim that it's not their responsibility to keep their goats out of Rav Yosef's unprotected field. Rather, it's Rav Yosef's responsibility to protect his field by fencing it. Now, this is not obviously Abiah's comment. So you have Rav Yosef on this side, and you have his neighbors, and his neighbors would let the goats go free. And Rav Yosef said, please act as an intermediary, he said to Abiah, and speak to the neighbors to keep their goats within their premises. And Abiah said to him, well, kind of what is the point, my master? Because at the end of the day, the neighbors are just going to say, well, then you need to build a fence. But we learn here a very important halacha that actually Rav Yosef is correct, because the onus is on the animal's owner to restrain his animal, not the landowner to fence his property. That's why the animal's owner must pay if she eats what is inside the shop on the side of the streets, and we do not say that the damaged party should have protected his goods. Obviously, it's saying Abiah, however, was simply seeking an excuse to avoid carrying out Rav Yosef's mission. I think he just didn't want to get
So just repeat that for 1 6, Ray. I just got distracted.
Okay, so why we're learning it in this Mishnah, or this Gemara, is that because that the Gemara is comprised of the Gemara, which is the commentary and explanation on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is the bottom line story or the bottom line legal case, and we derive halacha from the written Torah and certain expositions from the oral Torah. So we learn different halachas. So what halacha have we just learned in this case? That whoever owns the animals, it's their responsibility to prevent the animals going into the field of another, which is the Torah, Exodus, Shemot chapter 22, verse 4, that you shall not send your animal in the field of another. But it goes far as to say, from a halachic point of view, you have to fence around your property if you've got animals that could pose a danger and go into the neighbor's yard. So Abiah said the neighbors will just say it's up to you to make a fence, but the halacha isn't like that. It's the animals' owners that have to make a fence. So I think that Abiah didn't want to take offense and get involved in the case. So what are we learning from here is that then the Mishnah's, the Gemara is going to turn around and say one simple thing. It's going to say, if this is in fact the case, then when would you ever actually have a case where, when would you ever have a case when the animal itself would burrow? So in other words, the Gemara challenges Abiah, and it says, but if every landowner would be required to fence his property, how would you find a case where the merciful one on his Torah obligates a person for damage done through shame of his animal? So it was saying this challenge against the buyer, who was saying, listen, what would a buyer say if the halacha is like Rav Yosef, who's saying that the person that owns the animals has to fence his own property to prevent his animals from damaging another person's property? Then this is an argument against a buyer. So the Gemara challenges a buyer and says, listen, why are we learning cases of Shane here? Because if everybody had to fence their property automatically, then when would you ever have a case of Shane, where your neighbor's animals would come into your property? When would there ever be a case? So a buyer has to respond to this challenge of the Gemara. So basically, a buyer's response is as follows, is that you would find it where the animal actually burrows under a fence into the property. When did we learn this? We learned it in this very daf with a dog that burrows under a locked door in order to get the biscuits or the meat for Shane. If we're in a third party, we used that example of Michael, Gavin, Kevin, myself, and Arthur in a braai, and it's Arthur's kitchen, and I'm baking my biscuit there. And Michael brings his dog that burrows under the gate, and Arthur's not responsible because he locked his kitchen door, which is the realm of normal responsibility, but the dog burrowed under it. So it says when an animal burrows under a fence, in that case, you'd still have a case of Shane. So that's a buyer's challenge to the Gemara. And he said, furthermore, you'll find another case. There are often cases where a fence fell down at night. And where a fence fell down at night, an animal would have access to his neighbor's property. So that's a buyer's defense to say as far as that's concerned. But we still find that the ruling is actually like Rav Yosef. Okay, just to bring it clear. So I wanted to explain a separate case. It says a related ruling. So Rav Yosef and some say Rabba. So why does it do this in the Gemara? Often what happens is when we learn the Gemara, we talk about a case now with Rav Yosef and a buyer. Now what happens is often it goes on a tangent genically, which means in a nice way, it goes off on a tangent. And it's often done this way. It says, right, now we're on the subject of Rav Yosef, we're going to discuss other sort of principles Rav Yosef said. So we're learning it organically. So what is another principle Rav Yosef taught? It says in the Gemara, Rav Yosef and some say Rabba issued the following proclamation. So those going up from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael and those going down from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia should know the following law. If these goats of the meat market cause damage, we warn their owners about this 2 or 3 times, and if the owner heeds the warning and restrains his goat, fine. And if he does not heed the warning, then we say to him, sit at the butcher's place and take your money. Okay. Does anybody know what we're saying here, or do you want me to explain it in a clearer way?
I know what you're saying.
So
That
what
you're
am I
going
saying,
to.
Dad?
So you're saying that you're going to shechter the animal then,
Why?
because it's more than 3 times.
No. So you brought up some interesting points. You're somewhat there.
Yeah, but also with Karen, it's Tom, so it's a bit of a problem. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure actually. Yeah.
Okay, but you're on the right track. So we're saying, listen, these are special cases. These are cases of where you've got people that don't usually reside in the place. It's not a standard public domain like where you used to see your neighbor and he brings his ox there regularly. This is what you call migration trips. So it's when people go from what do you call it? From Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, or from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael. You can think of it from going like inter-country, because basically Babylonia and Israel was a vassal state of Rome. So I mean, it was quite a schlep. So what happens here is that these goats of the meat market. So what would happen is that you take your animals down. Now, it's not that you couldn't slaughter them locally. Sometimes you do a slaughter because you would take them and you would need cash to basically pay for your trip, or you would need the meat slaughtered so that you could basically have a bit of food on your journey. So what happens is this is a special case where you're traveling between two different countries. And we warn the owners about this 2 or 3 times. Now, Gavin did mark something interesting. He's saying that generally, would this be a case of tam or muad? So we say, no, this is unusual because any cuts that we've learned so far from a tam to become a muad has to damage more than 3 times, because on the 4th occurrence, it becomes muad. Here we say we only warn the owner 2 or 3 times. So it's less than the amount of times we warn an animal that goes from tam to muad, which is on the 3rd occurrence of warning. On the 4th one, it's liable for a muad payment. This is 2 to 3 times, and it's also a little vague because is it 2 times or is it 3 times? It like says 2 or 3 times. So obviously there's circumstances that we're not sure why it would be 2 versus 3. And we basically say if the owner heeds the warning and restrains his goat, fine. But if he does not heed the warning, we say to him, sit at the butcher's place and take the money. So we don't understand what this phrase is, sit at the butcher's place and take your money. And if these goats of the meat market cause damage. Okay, so I just want to add a little bit of clarity here. So what happened was as follows. You, in those days, basically in Talmudic times, even until recently, before the advent of electricity and refrigeration, it was standard practice not to slaughter your animal until the owner could be assured that its meat would be sold fresh. Meat that was fresh would be granted a much higher price than where it could possibly become rancid or deemed, super. I mean, you picture this, you're dealing with the hot sun in the middle of Babylonia and Eretz Israel in the middle of summer, and your meat is there and you've got no refrigeration. How long do you think it's going to last, guys? Not a very long time. So what happened is there were different prices. That's a good point Gavin's making, is that there were certain ways that people used to salt and preserve meat. There were 2 methods that were generally used, Kev. The one is what you call, like in America, they focus more on what you call beef jerky. So beef jerky is more a smoking way of preserving meat. So when we say preserving meat, I used to watch these cooking shows like Man and Fire or barbecue on like DSTV. So what Americans do is there are 2 ways to smoke foods. You've got what you call cold smoking, which is how they smoke salmon. Because if you use hot smoking methods to smoke salmon, you get a very, very fishy taste. Whereas when you use a cold smoking methodology, it's almost at ice temperature. You actually can't use that method before the advent of electricity because it almost gets smoked through refrigeration and cured. The meat gets cured. And that's how they smoke salmon in New York. I was watching this this thing with Andrew Zimmern, who shows like that they take tons in New York of salmon and distribute it all over the New York delis and how the cold smoking process works. But in the time of Babylonia of Eretz Israel, they only had hot smoking methods because you had heat. You couldn't smoke through refrigeration and cold processes. So you could either smoke the meat to preserve it, or you could salt the meat like biltong. But today, where we pay for that sort of meat as a delicacy, you can imagine it's not good for the diet to have constantly salted meat. It's not enjoyable. If you work at McDonald's every day, I remember in Stanton at the food court, you had a McDonald's there, and you had the Chinese place, and you had the pizza place, Debonair's and Steers. Kev, are you awake? Mm. And what used to happen is that people that worked in those places were so nauseated by their own food that they'd actually have an arrangement with all the other guys working in the different units. The Santon food court every day would speak to the Chinese guys and say, can I have a chop suey or a chow fan? And the guys in the Chinese place where their eyes got more splinter by every chop suey they ate, decided to order McDonald's food. So when you're eating the same sort of smoked processed food, you get very sick of it. So what would be a delicious treat in those days was actually fresh meat. It didn't have that salty or smoky taste. So today, where we pay a higher fee for smoked food, perhaps, or dried food like biltong, where we see it as a luxury. And even, you must know, salmon was a very cheap food, and so was herring. That's why poor Jews could afford to have it. Today, you pay more than a grand for salmon than you are for cocaine. So, I mean, it's become a luxury food. So in those days, the freshest meat was seen as a luxury product. And therefore, meat that was slaughtered and immediately fresh, because you didn't need refrigeration, would get you a higher market price. So what this part of the Gemara is saying is that if your animal cannot behave well in the trip between Eretz Israel and Babylonia, or Babylonia and Eretz Israel, it is your job to look after it. So you're given a warning, 2 or 3 times. And once you're given a warning, if you don't look after it, you're only taking it to those areas. We're saying goats that are destined for the meat market. In that particular case, you have to slaughter it prematurely because this goat is aggravating everybody, where you're not going to get the ideal price. Because again, the ideal price is when you slaughter your goat on market day, because you'll get the most amount of price because it's freshest. So if they had market day on a Wednesday and you slaughtered your goat on a Monday, you'd get Monday's day price. But if you brought it all the way on a Wednesday, where it wouldn't inconvenience the butcher because there's no refrigeration, you'd get much better price for your meat. But if in the 2 days your goat was misbehaving, the case here is we would never trouble the courts, because the difference between the market day price, which is the higher price, and the lower price, like Monday's price, wouldn't be enough of a financial loss to aggravate the court by you turning around saying, I'm not sending my goat to slaughter on the right day, and I'd rather trouble the court with this case for damages. The court is going to say, listen, you're not going to aggravate us with this damage. Take a slight loss and stop aggravating people with your goats if you can't look after it. But why did we learn this halacha from Rav Yosef? And this is a very interesting reason. Rav Yosef never threatened his neighbors and turned around and said, listen, if you don't put a fence around your property and keep in your goats, they're going to end up in the glue factory and they're going to end up in the meat market. He never actually threatened them, which means any goats that are not destined for the meat market specifically, and it seems that any goats that are not involved with this trip from Eretz Israel to Babylonia or vice versa, in other words, local domestic goats that you would use to milk and use as work animals and everything like that, you don't have to prematurely slaughter them. If they are going to cause damage, we go through the normal tam and muad process, like you would with any animal. And then you would trouble the court, and there'd have to be court verification that it's become muad, to gone from a tam state, and normal court process would apply. The only time that we cause the owner slight loss is if he was going to send his animal to the meat market anyway, which is, I assume, why he went from Babylonia to Eretz Israel. For maybe that, but maybe he needed to pay for his trip and get some fresh meat for his trip, or get some money for the trip. So we see here 2 halachas. Is Rav Yosef never threatened his neighbors, saying they're going to end up being slaughtered prematurely, because that would have sustained a bigger financial loss. In this particular case, it was minor as to whether the difference between optimum meat market prices on, for example, the day would be like Wednesday meat market, and they'd slaughter on Wednesday compared to Monday, and it would sit there for 2 days. So that's the halacha that we learn from this particular process, that the law only applies to goats already earmarked for slaughter, since the loss that the owner sustains by premature slaughter is not significant. This is according to Rashi. But goats that are being raised for their milk or sheep for their wool are not slaughtered in order to prevent them from causing damage. This can be seen from the previous case where Rav Yosef instructed a buyer only to order the Talmud family to guard their goats, but not to threaten to have the goats slaughtered. This is also according to Tosfot.
Damon?
All right, guys, so we finished
What were the goats? Sorry, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Were the goats eating the produce on someone else's private property? Was that what they were doing? These goats earmarked for slaughter. Is that what because they couldn't have been not violent, couldn't have been short, it couldn't have been Karen, or could it have? Was it a shame?
Okay, so this is I think Kevin's asking a great question. So let's examine this. Firstly, whenever it uses the word, those going up from Babylonia to Eretz Israel, and those going down from Eretz Israel to Babylonia should know the following law. If these goats of the meat market cause damage, now every time we've used the word cause damage, we're implying caring, always. Because in a public domain, you exempt for shame.
Yeah.
If you remember what happened with the animals that ate in the storefront, is you paid for, at certain points, if it didn't enter the storefront, but it was still in public, you would pay for damage to process, to other animals or to produce, etc., but not for the shame, not for the financial consumption worth. You pay for the value of the next meal. But depending on where it ate in the store. In other words, if it ate inside the store, that's a classic case of shame because the store owner is considered in his property. Therefore, shame would apply. If the animal ate in the public domain or walked in the public domain, you exempt for shame and record because it says if he sends his animal forward in the yard of another. So when we're talking about here, if I say you've got goats and we have to warn them 2 or 3 times from creating damage, they're obviously creating damage where they've got access to other animals or other people's belongings. And when they cause damage there, it's in that case you warn them because if it's not carrying damage, you don't warn. You pay. You're only warning, in other words, you're paying for the ton portion. You are paying for ton, but you're warning to say if you do it a certain number of times, it becomes muad. But again, you don't not pay for the ton pot. You do pay for the ton pot. You're just warning so that if it does it a certain number of times, it's now become a habitual damager or a habitual gora. So damage is referred to 2 things. It either attacks another animal, injures or kills it, or alternatively damages property belonging to somebody else. So we're talking in the case of Keren here, because if we talked in the case of shame, you're not liable if your animal eats in the domain of another. You're not liable if your animal eats in the public domain. So I've got my food in the public domain, or my kid, in that particular case, you're not liable for shame and regal. But if your animal ate a bag, my kid's bag with my iPhone in it, and it chomped the bag, goats eat anything, and it ate my jacket, you're responsible then not for shame. Why not for shame? Because it's unusual damage, and therefore being unusual damage, it fits in the case of Karen. Karen has 2 factors. It's where it's the animal's intent to injure or kill, and the other factor is the unusualness of the damage. So if an animal ate food that is appropriate for it, it goes under the category of shame. If an animal ate what is not appropriate for it, like a rucksack bag or a kit bag or a book, then that would be carrying damage because it's unusual damage and it's not appropriate for it. So Kevin, whenever it uses the word damage, it's considered carrying, and that's why we warn it 2 or 3 times. Yeah. Otherwise, you'd be liable for full payment. Again, shame in regal is full payment muad from the outset. So is a pit, so is a fire.
Because a goat isn't like ox. That's why it's not as dangerous. It wouldn't cause as much damage. That's why I just thought, I wasn't sure. Based on its size.
Although I must tell you something that a goat in certain places is much more destructive. We had neighbors, Margaret and Jeff, and they had a goat for their children. It ate everything in the property, from washing to implements to. They're very destruction in terms of, not in terms of the same body mass as a ox, because if an ox scores a person their tickets, it's more likely they'll be killed than injured. But I must tell you something, if a goat impales a person with a horn and you need to go on dialysis, that can cost you 200 grand a year. It's not cheap.
Yeah, it does a lot of damage. It can do. It
Yeah,
can be
and the
lethal.
amount of food that it eats. I'm not